Tarpley, welcome.
Thank you so much.
With regard to the present-day crisis in the Ukraine, it looks as if the Ukrainians themselves, even some of those in the military, are not really interested in fighting with Russia over this whole crisis to support this coup d'etat. How do you see it?
Well, I think you've pulled on the thread that leads to some extremely interesting consequences in analyzing this entire crisis now between January, February, March, April of 2014. If we look at the Ukrainian Republic, as it calls itself, with its capital in Kiev, what strikes us is that during the Crimean crisis, during the month of March primarily, what we found is that although there were Ukrainian military forces in the Crimea and nearby, they declined to resist the coming of Russian forces, coming out of the Russian bases that were already there. The Ukrainians wouldn't resist them. In other words, they wouldn't fight to defend their naval bases, their air bases, their army bases. They wouldn't fight to defend their headquarters. They wouldn't fight to defend their logistics. And then we had this interesting spectacle of the extreme right-wing, or I would say fascist or even neo-Nazi government in Kiev putting out repeated calls for the mobilization of reservists. And I've sort of lost count after 4 to 5 of such calls, but it's clear that they're putting out these calls to mobilize the reserve army and that nobody is coming forward, that there is a tremendous unwillingness, certainly to fight for the likes of President Turchinov, who is an ally of the gas princess Timoshenko, the great kleptocrat, the blonde lady who came out of jail, or the Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, another ally of Timoshenko, the gas princess. Nobody seems to be willing to risk their lives for these people. And indeed, you have big chunks of the Ukrainian Navy, of the Ukrainian Army, Ukrainian police force joining Russia. And so this is what you see. And then you read the newspaper accounts and you hear that John McCain is a great interpreter of these ideas. He says, the Ukrainian people feel betrayed because the United States has not helped them. You go back to Lyndon B. Johnson, who's been in the news these days, right? One of Lyndon B. Johnson and Nixon, one of their common expressions was, well, if there's a threat from communism, then those Asian boys are going to have to carry the ball, and only when they do something, when they resist, can the United States do anything to help them. And I think in this case that this has gone by the board. Somehow the Ukrainian view, as interpreted by McCain and others, and I think it's authentic, is that somehow it's up to the United States to pull the Ukrainian chestnuts out of the fire, even though the Ukrainians are unwilling to fight and die for their country. Somehow the United States is supposed to do that. And this strikes me as absolutely outrageous, right? Absolutely unacceptable. And I think this is a very, unjust indictment to send to the United States. So what I wanted to do then was to start from that and say, what is this, right? Where does this come from? What kind of country is Ukraine? Is this a country at all? I think it's worth remembering, being a country, having a country, is not automatic. And there's a very interesting literature, a lot of it conducted by Marxists, right, who are most interested in this problem. You can look at Marx and Engels. You can look at Lenin. And my personal favorite, Rosa Luxemburg, in this area. And what does it take to have a nation, right? What blocks of people have the wherewithal to become a country, right? It obviously requires a state, a nation state, an apparatus, right? Ministries, an army, a navy, perhaps. But it also requires culture. It requires a certain experience of self-government plays a big role. And as Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, you've also got to have something like a full-set economy. In other words, if you happen to be totally integrated into the economy of some larger entity, as Ukraine was, right, since it was built under the Soviet 5-year plans, and even today you see that the economic viability of Ukraine is practically non-existent, right? It cannot pay for gas, and its entire economic orientation is to the east, to Russia, but at the same time, this gang of adventurers we have in Kiev, the fascists and their frontmen in business suits, they insist on orienting towards the European Union. So what is this? And here's the thing that I found. You can make a preface to this. You can say, well, in the year 988, Kiev was the absolute center of Russian history because this is the moment where Grand Duke Vladimir of Kiev decides to convert to the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople. And this, of course, this has sweeping implications for all of Russian history, right? The presence of the Orthodox Church is the huge fact, right, starting in 988, and that has not changed. The entity that Grand Duke Vladimir was ruling over, though, did not call itself Ukraine. It called itself Russia, in effect. It's called the Kievan Rus, R-U-S, which, of course, is the origin of Russia, right? Or sometimes in Latin it came across as Ruthenia, and you sometimes hear Ukraine today described as Ruthenia, or sometimes also as Little Russia, along with White Russia and, of course, then Great Russia. So that's the Kievan Rus. But the Kievan Rus went out of existence in the 1200s because of the Mongols, right? Because of Genghis Khan and the Mongols that came after him. And when the Mongol tide receded over many centuries, much of Ukraine found itself under Poland. There was a very large Polish republic stretching practically from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and then a lot of it found itself in the Russian Empire, and some of it also in the Austro-Hungarian or Austrian Empire. So that's Kiev, right? And that's where Russia begins, right? As Putin says, Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. Absolutely true. But this was never Ukraine, right? It's funny because Ukraine means something like the border, to the border, at the border, something like this. That's the cry, I guess, in the Ukraine. But the Kiev Rus, it wasn't the border of anything. It was the center of the Russian world at that time. So you look through your historical atlas and you're looking in the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, and into the 1900s, there is nothing on the map, a political entity that calls itself Ukraine. It just does not exist. However, in the late 19th century, there was a movement among Romantic historians in many parts of Eastern, Southeastern Europe, Slavic Europe, to try to unearth one's own national history, right? And some of them had a fairly strong case, like the Czechs, right? Prague. And they had their historians who showed the role of the Czechs in the 30 Years' War and so forth. But you get to Ukraine, and it's very, very thin. By the time of the American Civil War, I guess we could say the number of books that had been published in Ukrainian was less than 50. Because Ukrainian was considered a dialect of Russian exclusively for peasants. And I think that would still hold true. In other words, Ukrainian is a dialect of Russian under the influence of Polish, a kind of a merger of the two, probably with the Russian element predominating, but a strong Polish emphasis coming in. But there never was such a country until World War I.
Well, Webster, you have a new article out entitled Metaphysical Doubts Concerning the Existence of Modern Ukraine, a 1918 creation of the German General Staff. You described the historical genesis of modern Ukraine as a nation called into being during World War I, but not by a popular movement of its own people.
That's right. That's right. And naturally, I have tried to lean on the people who have actually delved into the archives on this, and in particular two. One is the British historian Sir John Wheeler Bennett, who wrote the definitive account of the negotiations that went on in Brest-Litovsk in 1917-1918 involving Russia, Germany, Ukraine, Poland, Ottoman Empire, Austria, and others, right? That's one source, Sir John Wheeler Bennett. And John Wheeler Bennett was the head of the network. He's sort of the generation of a network that produced Kissinger in the next generation. So this is high-level British intelligence. And then we also have here Fritz Fischer, probably the most famous German historian since World War II. And this is his book, Germany's Grab for World Domination, which comes across in English as Germany's Aims in the First World War. And I simply add my voice to these, because these are very different people, that there was no Ukraine. In other words, this was a concept that existed for dreamers, for romantics, professors, historians, poets, right? There was Taras Shevchenko, the Ukrainian poet who made a big deal out of being Ukrainian, and some others, but this is very, very limited until we get into World War I. And here's sort of the way it happened. In September 1914, the Germans now realized that they're in a two-front war, which they didn't want, but there they are, right? They've lost the first Battle of the Marne. It's a two-front war. But at the German Foreign Ministry in Berlin, there appear people who call themselves Ukrainians. And some of them come from the Russian Empire, direct or through different countries, and some of them come from the part of Ukraine that's in Austria-Hungary. So the country that's allied, the only ally that the Germans had at this point. They'll get Turkey later, but at this moment it's just Vienna, right? Berlin, Vienna. So these people say, they come to the German Foreign Ministry and they say, we're Ukrainians and we're here to help you. The German response is, what's a Ukrainian? Never heard of it. And they have to order all kinds of studies, right? Ethnography, what it is, the Ukrainians, right? How many of them, where is it, and so forth. And essentially, the idea begins to grow in the German Foreign Office that you can use this idea of Ukraine to create serious problems for the Russian Empire. You can foment a rebellion, maybe, if you do this right. And normally they would have tried Poland, right? Poland was the obvious one because this was much more developed, because this had been a big, important, independent country for centuries up until the end of the 1700s, right, when it disappeared in the famous partitions of Poland. But Ukraine, again, there had never been Ukraine.